Which, hey, fucking, I guess we'll get to it if we get to it.
Hopefully,
I think streams are better. I think frames are better, hopefully. I don't know. Sorry about that, everyone. For some reason, we're experiencing some connection issues. Thank you, NFL Fan 12, for the follow, by the way. But yeah, okay. Looks better. Great. Good to hear. Let's get started.
So I'll resume again with the rules. As I said, generally be civil. No slurs, preferably. Thank you. Goes for you too, Juptej. I know you got something in there.
I'm always dropping them.
Yeah. Number two, I want to keep this discussion in good faith and productive. So if one of you asks a question and doesn't answer it, I'm going to make sure that you answer that question. I'm going to remind you. I'm going to butt in. I'm going to be like, hey, you answer that question that your opponent said. But generally, besides that, I trust you two to have generally have a good debate and discussion. And Kai, I'm going to allow you to have the first opening statement.
Yeah, sure thing. So as far as authoritarianism versus libertarianism goes, I don't know which way the debate's going to go, whether we take them to their logical extremes or whether it's just the limiting of government. I, however, am going to operate under the pretense that a government exists, and I would set up my framework as that a government should exist to make it easier for people to live good lives and to protect its constituency. And obviously, this is more in tune with representative government, which is the government we're currently operating in. So I'll operate under that framework for the debate. So I think right now we're witnessing a fantastic kind of climate that allows for this debate because, as I'm sure we're all aware, we're in a pandemic. And I believe that the actions taken by our government in many ways were not enough from the beginning. And I am actually, despite what many of my other right-leaning friends believe, I'm pretty conscious of the way that the coronavirus has changed our lives, and I believe that the government has stepped in good ways to keep us safer. I believe the government must exist to exert some force or pressure onto markets or onto businesses in the hopes to protect people and to avoid unnecessary exploitation. Obviously, there's an entire debate about the definition of that, but that is pretty much why I'd say a government should exist and does exist, and is better than libertarianism.
All right, thank you very much. Juptej, you may now have your opening statement.
All right. Well, first of all, welcome everyone. Sorry again for the stream cutting off a little bit. So the framework that I've chosen to kind of discuss whether or not authoritarianism versus libertarianism is better is through the lens of egalitarianism. So egalitarianism is the belief that all people, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, place of birth, or any other external factors, should have the equal opportunity to succeed, and in the presence of inequality, we should strive to rectify and balance those outcomes. And in my opinion, libertarianism, more specifically left libertarianism, is a direct extension of those values. Things like erasing social stratification, encouraging the intermingling of communities, and allowing people to live their lives free of the imposition of coercive and involuntary hierarchies are steps forwards towards a more just society. The goals of any government, I believe, should be to serve the people they represent and help create the environments necessary to allow people to live fulfilling lives of their own volition. Authoritarianism goes directly against these principles. Authoritarianism glorifies the state as a means to an end of imposing one's own moral prescriptions onto members of society without even taking into account whether these prescriptions are even relevant in the issues faced by the average person. It uses the state as an arm to crack down on those who oppose the views of the ruling class. Throughout history, we've seen the inability of authoritarian governments to achieve any level of stability or longevity in their rule, and exploitative forces have always been replaced by more democratic means of functionality. I argue that to drift into authoritarianism is to reject the fundamentals of this country as well as the core views of the Enlightenment, which are the basis of the Western civilization many authoritarians pretend to respect. Furthermore, any attempt to infringe on rights people have already been granted has been met with absolute dissent. You can look no further than the Prohibition, an utter failure by any account. Even more minor things that we take for granted, such as the weekend, the 8-hour work week, have all been fought for by left libertarians and are now a basic part of our everyday lives. The way to achieve happiness, a happier society as a whole, isn't to treat the citizenry as children to be guided along a rope, but to actively... Yep, last sentence. To actively and essentially eternally fight for societal changes which disincentivize harmful tendencies.
Thank you very much for your opening statement. I have an opening question just so we can get this conversation started. And the question is, does libertarianism protect the average person? If so, how? You may begin, Juptej.
All right. Well, I think libertarianism really just seeks to provide the individual with more autonomy, more dignity, and more control over their everyday lives. I would say libertarianism absolutely and undeniably protects individual rights. I don't think there's any real way that you can argue against that.
Yeah. No, I actually have to agree. I think it absolutely protects individual rights. I think we just disagree on the efficacy of allowing anybody to do whatever they want. Obviously, that might not be the prescription you're making. There's obviously the bounds of reason. But I believe certainly within your framework of equality, it's a little bit puzzling that you would believe that either equal outcomes or equal opportunity would thrive in a environment removed from regulation. And I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that. Do you believe that every individual acts in the same way and has the same aptitude to resisting, say, coercive and destructive features in a society? And do you believe that if let to their own accord, every man is going to create a prosperous and an egalitarian society for themselves?
Well, of course not, but I also don't believe that like like libertarianism lives inside of a vacuum. You know what I mean? I don't think it's just we go from today living under the imposition of a government or whatever the values of another class to tomorrow we just strip all those down and we're left in a lawless society. I think the difference between a lot of left libertarian values and like sort of right libertarianism, which is like what most people associate with libertarianism, is right libertarianism is the sort of idea of like, leave me alone. You know what I mean? Let me live my life the way I want to. Whereas left libertarianism sees society as a collective and something to be respected, appreciated, and guided along. Not necessarily guided along, but shaped by the people that exist within it, right? So it's individualism in the sense that it bolsters the individual's ability to influence the society that they live under.
Okay, so it's like voluntary collectivism in a sense, the individual's right to associate with whoever they will.
Really more like the individual's right to exist under any framework of hierarchy, essentially.
Okay, all right. Then what hierarchies do you believe that, or rather that you hope to fight most against with left-leaning libertarianism?
Well, I mean, as a leftist, I would say the main one is the hierarchy that exists in the workplace. Democratizing the workplace, I think, is I think it's weird that we value democracy so much in our everyday lives, and yet when it comes to the workplace, we are 100% okay with living under an authoritarian framework and an almost dictatorial framework. Especially when the workplace is what affects us in our day-to-day lives. I think democratizing the workplace is the first step forward towards achieving a more, I guess, classically individualist society.
Okay, and you think that this is thwarted right now through, like oppression of labor unions or otherwise forcing people into situations where they take jobs they have to?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the workplace right now is coercive in nature.
Okay, because the structure of capitalism, I'm kind of putting words in your mouth here. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this because you believe the structure of capitalism is coercive in nature?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm finding that you are assuming, or I'm going to run through a thought process with you. I find that you believe that with left-leaning libertarianism, which I don't believe it just descends into anarchy one day all of a sudden, but under that structure, plenty of people have the opportunity to say, have communities and to collectivize the workplace, to kind of remove the structures of capitalism within their own lives. But it does absolutely nothing to make the lives of people who are operating under voluntarily created capitalist structures in a different sphere, it does nothing to stop them from being oppressed. And I believe it is the job of the government, and it is the ability of the government to stop people universally from being oppressed. Is it always good at that? Absolutely not. Is that the aim, and does it have the power to? Absolutely.
Well, what do you mean by voluntarily creating a capitalist structure? Are you talking about like in the sort of like ideal left libertarian society?
Well, I don't know what that society is, but I'm telling you. So you've got your one society that collectivizes the workforce or whatnot, and then you have another society, say like they become an Ancapistan or whatever. They take the right leaning approach of like, now we're going to have we're going to have the same kind of capitalist structure, but there's even less regulation. There's no government interference. And now the people who are most vulnerable to being exploited, to having their labor exploited, they are not protected.
Well, yeah, sure, but left libertarians
Oh,
fight against
wait.
those structures to begin with.
Well, and what?
Left libertarians fight against capitalism, which would include anarcho-capitalism.
Wait, so the people voluntarily associating and taking their rights as individuals only through voluntary means, and I mean you're not infringing on other people's rights, correct?
What do you mean?
Okay, so within left libertarianism, a principle would be that you're not infringing on other people's rights. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, then why do you believe that you could possibly stop somebody else from creating that power structure of capitalism with a bunch of people who are easily coerced into it?
Social disincentivization and a restructuring of the way that our government functions. A
With
restructuring
who?
of the way. What do you mean with who? With the people, with the government.
But it's not, see, I think you're being too general about this. It's not just the people. There's plenty of people who would agree with you. I'm absolutely sure of that. They would build communes, they would have smaller societies. But you're leaving out what I believe is even a larger proportion of people who continue being oppressed because they are not naturally inclined to stop themselves from being coerced. And if you wanted to break down capitalism, if you wanted to destroy that capitalist system that another person had voluntarily created with employees that were nothing but voluntarily coerced, you would have to use
There's no
force.
such thing as voluntary coercion.
I don't
There's
know.
no,
I
there's
think,
no
I
such
think
thing
you,
as if
I
you're
think you can
coerced, how
also,
is it voluntary?
I think then it might be in the semantics of my language. I'm trying to think of a better word. Somebody who might be less able or cannot so clearly see another opportunity might very easily pick up on some like ANCAP who has created this like monetary structure, this capitalist structure. In the same world that the communes exist, so can ANCAPistan exist.
Well, sure,
You
but
have all the power through social incentivization to protect the people in your community, but you have absolutely no authority to do anything about the people outside of it. And the only thing you have is your opportunity to beat them in the marketplace of ideas, which I don't think is realistic.
well, okay, sure, but for one, I'm really operating under the notion that more libertarianism, drifting towards a libertarian solution, is a better idea. So I'm not necessarily advocating for an anarchist society. Second of all, I guess you could make the argument that people are always going to be coerced. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I assume like if by voluntary coercion you kind of mean like kind of like we have now, where I guess people are voluntarily taking up jobs, but in terms of like coercion, it's undeniable that it exists. But that's more of an issue of class consciousness and bringing about class consciousness within the society. It's all of this is a gradual change. I don't think we're not talking about tomorrow everybody's class conscious and we revolt for anarchism or whatever. It's gradual societal broad changes.
But you would admit that you do want to move towards the destruction of the state, or rather just the move away from the state, not necessarily destruction, but just taking the state out of the picture in favor of those individual liberties, right?
I would want to decentralize the power, yes.
Into the hands of the individual. And then my issue with that is you can only do that, at least effectively, when you've convinced enough people that your train of thought is right. I mean, this has been an ideological war, the idea of capitalism versus socialism, Marxism, or even just authoritarianism versus libertarianism. That's been a constant ideological struggle for centuries. And I don't think that it is plausible to believe you could work even a majority of people, or like a super majority, like 2/3, into one camp or the other. I think you are always going to have people fall to the other side. The difference is you can do nothing about the people who fall to the other side except tell them, no, the way you're doing things is wrong. No, the way you're doing things, you're being exploited. That's all you can do.
Yeah, so what exactly is your point?
That
Like
you've
people are
now
always people are always gonna have different opinions, but when you're talking about authoritarianism versus libertarianism, it's not as if like since I'm a libertarian, I can no longer like convince other people. Like what exactly is your point there?
No. I think you're misunderstanding my point. Sorry to interrupt you there, but it's
No
like
problem.
the difference is not that you no longer can like convince people. Of course you can convince people. I mean, let's be reasonable. You probably won't convince 2/3 of everyone. I don't think anybody really can do that. But what an authoritarian government can do is say, you know what? Sorry, I didn't convince you. You're being exploited. I'm going to enact legislation that protects, exploitation in these and these and these forms. You can say, oh, okay, payday loans, not a very good thing. I don't care if they're a voluntary interaction. I don't care if you signed a check or whatnot saying that I am submitting myself to this loan. But the government has the authority. It doesn't have to compete in this marketplace of ideas. Authoritarianism has an authority by which it can protect people that you simply don't have.
Okay, here's the sort of thing that I think that we're falling into that we need to talk about. So we're talking about positive liberties versus negative liberties here, right? So a negative liberty would be like the absence of like external factors that make an imposition on the way that you're going to act, whereas a positive liberty is the presence of self-control and fulfillment with the decisions that you make. So left libertarianism would bolster positive freedoms for the individual. When you're talking about like payday loans and stuff like that, those are corporate practices. You're never going to find me like defending those or saying that they should be allowed to exist within a voluntary hierarchical system. Obviously, I don't think I'm an anti-statist. I would still want to use state power in order to crack down on corporations. But when you talk about libertarianism, that is the bolstering of the individual. So in terms of bolstering the individual, it's bolstering their ability to make decisions free of coercion. Something like a payday loan would be based in coercion.
But see, I still don't know. And even if it was based in coercion, every part of it is given to you. And you could only make the claim that the system as a whole is coercive. And I think there we would plainly disagree, but that's just another discussion about the structure of capitalism. I think the issue is that by opening up those floodgates of the positive rights as well as the negative rights or whatnot, I think you are submitting the people who are most vulnerable to being abused. Say, for instance, okay. Give me some positive rights that you seek to enhance and take away the state's kind of pressure on them.
So again, like we were talking earlier about like the worker co-ops, right? Like if you look at like something like, I know you like UBI a lot, right? So with UBI, the benefit there is that you get the freedom to spend your money as you wish, right? Fine, good. That's a negative freedom. Negative not in terms of I'm making a moral prescription on it, but just in terms of the actual like use of the terminology. That would be a negative freedom because it's free of imposition. But positive freedom would be something like a worker co-op, where it allows you to not only spend the money as you wish, but it frees you of the coercive pressures of corporatism in the workplace and that freedom to spend your money. So that would be a positive freedom. It frees you of the pressure of corporatism. Or if you look at something like cigarettes, right? Like cigarette smoking, okay, sure, you're making the decision to smoke the cigarette. That would be a negative freedom. But the positive freedom there would be the freedom of I guess addiction that you get from the nicotine, the freedom of the social consequences of not smoking, like things like this would external factors would be the positive freedoms.
Okay. Well, then I guess I should ask. Maybe I just missed it earlier on. But then, are you still fine with having a state to kind of regulate negative freedoms or negative rights?
What do you mean by regulating negative rights?
Well, for instance, marijuana is illegal in what is it? I think a little less than the majority of the states. Well, marijuana is a little bit of a difficult one, but say cocaine, right? Like you could argue that people have a negative right to cocaine or to use it. Would you take away the government's power in keeping it illegal?
Yeah, I'm for the decriminalization of drugs.
Okay, and I'm assuming you extend that to things like pornography.
100%. Yeah.
And you extend that then to things, I would say, like payday loans.
Where do you get that? See,
Because I don't think
you can make a
I don't
clear
think payday
no.
loans.
You can draw a clear line from something like drugs to pornography, because it's like, okay, with something like the okay, the reason why I want to decriminalize drugs is because drugs are an addictive force. I don't think you can blame the person for doing drugs in a lot of cases. Like criminalizing drugs is just the data proves that it just doesn't work. It draws people into cycles of criminality, whatever. Pornography, again. Well,
Ooh, I should have been more clear than in asking. Are you in favor of negative rights in the way that they are now, like with drugs or whatever, because you believe that people have a right to do them, or because you believe that decriminalizing it would just be better?
well, I would say both in a sense. I feel like with
Okay.
something like I
Because
mean,
I don't really care about the second argument of like whether the decriminalization works more. I'm more kind
you
of
don't care about whether
no,
decriminalization
no.
works.
I do care. Just pertaining to the debate,
Okay.
I am much more interested in whether you believe that somebody has a right to it.
Yeah, sure. I believe, just generally speaking, you would have a right as long as it's consensual without a greater um I guess, damage to society. But I think with the decriminalization of drugs, there comes the asterisk of one, providing treatment to, like, I feel like you can't separate these, right? Even in this discussion, because something like decriminalizing drugs or something like pornography or something like payday loans, they don't exist in a vacuum. It's not just you get to do a payday loan because you have the right to do that. That's more of an ANCAP argument. I'm talking about destroying the structures in the first place. So destroying things like destroying something like a payday loan would be more of introducing positive freedoms, because you're free from the I guess the coercive nature of payday loans.
And you don't believe there's a coercive nature around drug use?
I believe as it exists right now, there is a coercive nature around it, but again, they don't exist in a bubble. The coercive nature comes in the addiction and the poverty ridden in a lot of these drug ridden communities, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Criminalizing drugs only blames the person for, okay. When you talk about payday loans, we're not arresting people for doing payday loans, right? The
Not
payday
yet.
loans are okay.
I want to. I don't think payday loans are good.
You want to arrest people for getting payday loans?
No, that was hyperbolic. I think that we should.
But you want to punish people for getting payday loans?
No, I think I want to punish people for providing them, and I want to stop the practice.
Totally based. Hey, I would totally agree with you there, brother. But that's the thing. That's the difference between something like drugs and payday loans, right? Is even in terms of like distributing drugs, a lot of these things are more intrinsically linked to poverty and to cycles of criminality than they are on directly exploitative measures. So payday loans are directly meant to be exploitative, whereas a lot of times with drugs and with the drug industry, people have fallen into coercion. Even distributors are being coerced. So I don't think you can blame the person for their coercion.
Okay, well that's interesting. So you believe that, like for instance, like extrapolating language, you believe that drug like sellers or the plugs would be coerced because they were trying to earn money or something, right?
Yeah, crime is 100% more tied to poverty and also the war on drugs. That's a whole nother thing. We can get into that, but yeah, 100%.
Okay, and then so would you see drug use decreasing with within your kind of more libertarian left society, like removing the structures of capitalism, speaking ideologically? Do you believe that drug use would decrease?
That's what the data shows.
Wait, can you actually pull that, or just like message me it afterwards, because that's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, sure.
But
I'm looking at data right here that in my ideal form of decriminalizing drugs, it would be less of you get arrested and thrown in the slammer for doing a line of coke or something, and more so you go to rehabilitation. Rehabilitation
no,
is
no,
shown
hold on.
across the board to work.
I agree with you there. But I don't think that's what I was interested in. I was more interested in the idea that if the structures of capitalism are removed, so if money is removed as the reason for selling the drugs, do people sell less drugs, or are drugs less of a societal phenomenon? That's what I was really
There's
interested
no
in.
real way to make that prescription.
Which is why I was like, do you have data for that? That's like, wow.
Yeah, no. I thought you were just asking in general, like, does decriminalization lead to less drugs? Which, yeah, the data 100% backs that up.
No. So, but what I think is that there's natural phenomenons that I believe are incredibly damaging. I think marijuana use is incredibly harmful, and whether or not I believe it should be illegal is in this discussion irrelevant to me. The idea that it has very adverse effects, cocaine, meth, everything else like that. And you don't arrive at cocaine and meth and whatnot because of capitalism necessarily. You arrive at it because you were fed a gateway drug. And I think if we can reasonably ascertain that marijuana would still exist and would be a very social phenomenon even when capitalism is removed, I don't think that's a stretch. I mean, like, stop me if I'm going too far here. But if we know that that is a fact, and given all of the causal evidence linking marijuana to be a gateway drug, I mean, there's no argument that methamphetamine, that other types of drugs would be rampant. And you were arguing that the state should do nothing to prohibit that. It should not lock up and it should not punish the people selling the drugs. It should stand by.
That's not what I argued at all. I talked about rehabilitation.
Well, okay, but what do you believe then the state should do about that?
Rehabilitation.
No, okay. But I understand rehabilitation on the part of the user. What are you doing to the person selling the drugs?
Even in terms of the person selling the drugs. I mean, if right now, again, 100% rehabilitation is a broader sort of system for justice. It's not just rehabilitation. Rehab isn't just.
Yeah, take me through that though.
What do you mean take you through? Like take you through the rehabilitation process?
How to rehabilitate a drug seller?
Well, I don't have any, like, I'm not an expert on rehabilitation, but the data that I've seen shows that even rehabilitating drug offenders, like drug distributors, works. Drug distribution goes way down. People are much less likely to like recidivism rates go way down. I don't know exactly what the process entails, but I don't think that's necessarily relevant to the discussion.
Well, I think it's relevant within this discussion of what we should do with the people selling drugs. Do you believe that selling drugs should be illegal?
I believe that as of right now, no, it should not.
It should not be illegal to sell drugs?
No, because again, in a lot of those drug-ridden areas, those are more of a result of the war on drugs and poverty than any other factor.
I understand that. But okay, well then I should ask, are you then only in favor of making drugs legal because it would reduce disparate outcomes in sentencing or in the judicial system and whatnot, and because it's like the result of the war on drugs? Or are you in favor of legalizing selling drugs because you believe that it's somebody's right? That's my interest. I'm not interested in pragmatically speaking, rehabilitating people works a lot better. It's like, I substantively agree with you. I'm more interested in if you believe it's a right.
Yeah, I believe people generally have the right to do drugs if they want to.
To sell drugs.
Sure.
That's what I'm asking.
Sure.
Okay, so if you believe that somebody has the right to sell drugs, and if you believe the state should not impede on that right, then you must admit that there are people vulnerable to being exploited in that way.
Yeah, of course. But again, it's more about social disincentivization and a gradual change towards not outlawing a lot of these drugs, but like if you're talking about something like weed, I don't really think that there's any concrete data on like weed having like adversely negative effects on someone's body.
There absolutely is.
Like what?
Here, hold on. I've got an article right here. I used this in my last debate about marijuana. It increases the risks of schizophrenia or just other psychoactive disorders and whatnot. It increases the risk of obviously, like any kind of lung illness because you're inhaling smoke. But it also substantive, or rather, and this is the interesting thing about the study, right? And this is in the Lancet. I can pull it up real quick for you. But what they found, and scientists very rarely like to use the word causal, they said you found as close to as you could get a causal relationship between a permanent stunt in IQ and the use of marijuana, or rather from the use of marijuana. And I mean, we'd have to argue then about whether you think that's adverse or not, but I think that is very plainly adverse.
Sure, but then again, my argument goes right back to social disincentivization. You look at cigarettes. I'm going to use the cigarettes example again. Those were a huge, huge part of the culture. And I'm going to compare that to alcohol and prohibition. I think they have a... Hold on, wait a second. Alcohol and cigarettes, I think, played a similar role in terms of their size, their pervasiveness in the culture, right? You look at something like prohibition, which outlawed alcohol, which was a failure by every metric.
Disagree.
Okay, you're wrong, but anyways, look at prohibition, which was a failure by every metric, or you look at the sort of campaign against cigarettes that's undergone the past 30 years, which has been much more effective in getting people to stop doing to stop smoking. I mean, cigarettes are like looked down upon in society. Social disincentivization works, and I think making something illegal just doesn't. It just throws people into cycles of criminality, which is bad.
Wait, hold on, but you realize like the very, very crucial reasons. By the way, I just linked you that marijuana study, but the very, very crucial reasons behind the disincentivization culturally of cigarettes, for instance, is government. The government's ability to raise taxes on cigarettes, the government's ability to push for advertising that removed that positive light, the government's ability, the authority that it has was very, very crucially a reason for the disincentivization of a certain bad thing. And this is what we see, is that the government has a normative influence on culture and on society. Take, for instance, gambling. When gambling became legal, without any advertising for it, done by the government, I mean, but when gambling became legal, I want to pick out the specific language, but in the states where it was, what we saw was not only an in the rates of gambling in comparison to other places, right, or beforehand, because there were periods of legality and illegality and legality, but there was a genuine effect and a positive influence of government on the social acceptance of something by people. And so what we're arguing is you want people in communities, privately or individually, to provide a social effect or a social influence that discourages people from making bad choices. What I want is the government to take charge, use the power and authority it has to stop vulnerable people from being manipulated not only by drugs and alcohol and snake oil sellers, but by the markets as well. And I believe the government has a far better opportunity and power to do so than any kind of move towards liberty would.
So a couple of things here. One, the government just doing something doesn't necessarily equate to authoritarianism. And even if it does, that would be one specific way in which the government has used its authority, and doesn't equate to just being an authoritarian government. I mean, we just talked about the difference between prohibition and the cigarettes campaign, which I really don't know why you think prohibition was like successful. It was the only fucking amendment that we've ever repealed. I have no idea with what authority you're saying that prohibition was successful, but a social disincentivization campaign, which first of all was fought for by advocacy groups and lobbyists, is much different than the government using its authority to outlaw ban something. Because again, encouraging people to make good decisions leads to much more fulfilling outcomes than telling them what those fulfilling decisions should be.
And I think the way that I look at it is not necessarily as telling people what the good decisions should be, but removing the factors that encourage people to make bad choices. Removing, like I say all the time, it's like you have a parent, or it's like you were the parent and you've got a child, and you don't want to set your child out into a bunch of knives and needles and syringes. You don't want to set them on that floor and tell them, now don't touch any of that, because that's not a good thing. It'll hurt you. You don't want to do that. You want to remove the needles. You want to remove the things that your child is either more tempted to put in its mouth or more tempted to be hurt by. You want to remove those. And what I find is that, and I don't know if you have a metric for it, but you are very adamant that the influences that individuals and communities have on the greater society is enough to keep people out of harm's way. And I just believe there are too many vulnerable people for us to rely on that normative influence.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we're running into in that. One of them is our fundamental disagreement on what the government should be. You believe the government should be a parental figure in determining what and what isn't, I guess, moral purity or a fulfilling life. I completely disagree with that. I mean, I'm religious as well, but I don't think imposing your religious or moral prescriptions onto the world necessarily encourages others to lead fulfilling lives, because one, I don't think I'm the one that gets to decide what is fulfilling for each individual person, because like you said, each individual person has their own different metrics and their own different ways of living that necessarily can't be defined by a governing body. So that's one. And number two, even though I have a moral prescription, I don't believe that everybody else necessarily has to follow that. I just don't see why you believe that the government, instead of being a representative body of the people to showcase a will of the people, insofar as such a thing even exists, should be a parent.
Oh, I believe it certainly is. I think that the government should absolutely reflect the will of the people. I mean, paleoconservatism is, in its origin, it is Republican, it is representative, and it does want, obviously, this role of government to protect people and to do what is good.
Hold on, aren't paleoconservatives anti-democracy?
No, I mean, maybe in like a Socratic sense, that we believe that there is plenty of people who just make the wrong decisions, but rather that we require checks and balances in order to weed that out.
What do you mean by checks and balances? You're talking about like literacy tests?
That's just like the multiple stages of government. I mean, with the creation of the country, we didn't even have people voting for their national representatives. We had them voting for their local representatives, who in turn voted in their national representatives. For instance, the Electoral College to paleoconservatives is really important, because full democracy is the oppression of the minority by the 51%, right? So I'm sure there's certain paleoconservatives who are far more anti-democracy, but I think most just take like a Socratic sense that there's a lot of people who are stupid.
So you don't think...
Sorry, hold on. I just want to let you know you guys have only about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to cut you off in a bit to give you closing statements. Okay. So I really, really disagree with that. I don't think, hey, I totally agree with you. There are a lot of dumb people out there, but I think that can be fixed through two things. One is, well, not fixed. I think it can be fixed by one thing, and I think it's justified by another. One, education reform. I mean, I don't know why anybody would disagree with this. I don't know if you do. Education reform is like the number one thing. Second, I don't believe just because you may have a lower IQ than me means that you should get any less say in what goes on in your life. The government, the governmental body, these are all, it's not like they only affect a few select people. They affect everyone living within that society. And I believe if you live in our society, you should get a say. If the policies affect you, you should be able to decide what those policies are.
Yeah, no, I want to clarify. I never referenced IQ. I don't think that should be it. But I can tell you one thing, which is that for a long time we've had plenty of educational requirements as to U.S. Gov classes and whatnot. We have to take tests in order to show a level of a level of aptitude about government before we have to or before we can graduate high school.
Sure.
And I can tell you that regardless of whatever reform we do, there's plenty of people who are uninterested. And I think even more recently, voting has become a trend. And I don't think that is what it should be. I think we have to have people who are who are really committed to operating and to providing, better input into what our country can be. So I want not only, I kind of agree with the general sentiment that you should have a right to discuss what's going on to you and to your body, right? But at the same time, I think that if 51% of people all voted for something that was, just like egregiously and philosophically like disprovable and wrong, I don't believe that they should have the governing say. And that's why we do have the kinds of checks and balances of government that we have. That's why we're representative rather than full. But we're kind of veering off topic. Sorry, I don't mean to take it down that path. I think, if anything, we are working in between the semantics of what is the size of the government and at what point is it authoritarian and what point is it just like governing or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, in my final statement, I would just say that I believe that, we should operate under a representative kind of republic, and we should really view the government as a good thing that has the power to do a lot of good, and we should feed it a lot of those good things that it can do. We're supposed to bring those ideas forward. We should talk to our senators. We should write to our representatives. And that's something that I wish a lot more people did and a lot more people were interested in. And I believe that the government, more than any individual, has the power to keep people away from bad things. And I think it also removes the threat of people being tricked into thinking that those bad things are good for them. That's a common phenomenon I see, is that we convince ourselves that we are being made better by one thing, when in fact, it is only benefiting by us believing that lie.
All right, am I gonna do my closing statement now? Should I respond or just go to a closing statement?
Just go to a closing statement.
Okay.
Wrap this up.
Yeah, for my closing statement, I'll just say I think there's a lot of different ideas on what libertarianism is. I think there's a lot of conflation around libertarianism and other ideologies, but the basic idea is to give the individual more freedoms, more authority, and more relevance in their own lives. To lead fulfilling lives by their own volition, by their own metrics, and to have a say in the policies and the decisions that affect their own lives. Libertarianism is less about just let everyone run free and do whatever the fuck they want. It's about bolstering your communities. It's about bolstering your society into a place where collectively you can all decide on the things that affect you. Also trans rights. That's it.
Well, if that is our final statements from these two lovely gentlemen, then I feel like that is the end of our debate. Thank you very much, Kai, for joining us for this debate today. Thank you, Juptej, for keeping this civil. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. And I guess we'll let you go, Kai. I know you're a busy man. So thank you.